Creator of Sandman and author of books such as Good Omens, American Gods, and Coraline, Neil Gaiman is a master of storytelling across media formats, mesmerizing his global audience. Neil, thank you for joining us today from the beautiful Isle of Skye. This chat will be held by FSB Comunicação, with support of Intrínseca and CCXP, and we'll be talking about storytelling. And the conversation will be joined by Filipe Vilicic, journalist and writer, and Alexandre Callari, editor and writer. So I'd like to start with a somewhat large question. Has anything changed for storytelling the course of the last year? And for the storyteller, I imagine it must be hard talking about dystopia after a year that has changed what the word means. And for the storyteller,
I think you've got three very big questions there. The first is, has anything changed? And the answer is yes, COVID has changed. And COVID has changed everything. Very big question. People have discovered how incredibly fragile the civilizations and the systems that they're in can be, and how easily those things break. So the kinds of stories that we tell, the kinds of things that we do with stories in many ways have changed. Television has become much more important, and written fiction has become hugely important. Comfort fiction has, I think, become more important too. People are reading. I talk a lot to people, and they're talking about finding comfort in books and finding comfort in fiction, rather than necessarily challenging themselves. You were saying it's hard to write dystopias. Right now, it's hard to write dystopias, and I think the same way that it's very hard to write satire is you're going, well, if these people are behaving in ways that are so far beyond what I would have done as a satire, if I was making fun of things, I wouldn't have gone here. I mean, Trump is this sad, pathetic joke, and watching what he's doing now, trying desperately to cling on to power, it's just like, oh my gosh, this is the subject of innumerable bad and possibly good plays and films and novels and poems about what's going on inside his head during this mess. I find myself remembering the amazing Altman Nixon film, which is basically a giant long Nixon rant. And it's like, well, imagine the giant long Trump on the golf course rant as he sees it all going away. But I don't think any of us would have written this as fiction. It's because it's all too silly. I love the fact that in all of the pandemic fiction that we've had so far, and we've had, there's a fair amount of pandemic fiction, but it's all about people suddenly going, oh my God, there's a pandemic, and the government going, we are efficient and sensible, and we know what to do, and we're fixing things. And oh my God, will the clever scientists come in before it's too late? The idea that we would go, there is a pandemic, and millions upon millions of people would suddenly take this opportunity to go, we're not really comfortable with the whole germ theory of disease. You're saying there are invisible microbes, and I mean, duh. And you're just like, no, guys, I wouldn't have dared write that. That's just too silly. Sorry, little rant there.
Neil, first of all, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to talk with you. Besides my work as an author, I'm also an author from Intrínseca. I'm a comic book collector and a huge fan of your work. I even studied Sandman's covers in college for the perspective of Freud's theory of dreams. So I'm a huge fan, man. And you were just talking about the pandemic scenario, the COVID scenario. And there's a sense that after that, will be more familiar, more even intimate with screens, social networks, the virtual universe. But there are some authors like Alan Moore that defend that in those screens, the magic of the story is lost, that it's impossible to tell a profound narrative in cinema or social network. But you are, for me, the proof of the contrary. So how you tell very profound stories and dense ones in any medium, in any platform?
I think one of the, there are different ways to approach adaptations of your stuff. And I have probably done each version that it's possible to do. There is the version where you say to the, much like Alan Moore used to do, you go, well, I created it, but go make a movie, go make TV. Then there's the version which I did say for Coraline, where I knew that I wanted Henry Selick to do the adaptation of Coraline. So when I finished writing Coraline, I sent it to my film agent and I said, please get this on Henry Selick's desk. And he did. And then I went and saw Henry and had dinner with Henry and I said, I want you to do this. And he said, I want to do this. And then Henry wrote a script and I read it. And I told him it was too much like the book. And I said, look, you really need to open this up a bit because it's a film. It's not the book. And right now, there is too much of a girl walking down corridors. You have to make this yours if you're going to make it as a movie. And Henry went off and rewrote the script. And a year later, I read a script and it was fabulous. And then it just took him 8 or 9 years to get it made because the process of stop motion animation is incredibly slow. Or, there are things that I've done like Neverwhere, the TV series, where I got really involved, but I didn't really know what was happening. I was learning everything and every process. But that meant that when I came to do Good Omens, I knew how to do it. And also, when I came to do Good Omens, I'd watched enough things going wrong. I'd learned a lot about what could go wrong. And I'd learned, I'd made 2 episodes of Doctor Who. And I like to think that the 2 scripts I wrote were pretty much sort of equal in terms of quality. One of them was a fabulous episode, and one of them is one that has some good bits, but is mostly a mess. And the biggest problem between the 2 was decisions that were not mine, that were made along the way. Whether it was casting decisions about what they could afford, decisions about what to cut, places where the art, in one of my episodes, the art department wound up rewriting chunks of script for what they could do, what they already had in the art department that they could break out and stuff. And so when it came to doing Good Omens, I knew what could go wrong. And the reason why I made myself showrunner on it was because I didn't want to hand over scripts to people and then have a 50-50 chance of it being good. And I just wanted to be there and going, look, if somebody is going to mess this up, it ought to be me. So that for me was very important. I love moving things from medium to medium. I've never been somebody who felt that one medium was privileged over another medium. I started out in comics, which was it wasn't even in the gutter. Comics, when I started writing in comics, we were the drain that the gutter ran into. We looked up to the people in the gutter. We used to dream of making it up into the gutter. So as things have gone along, and I've wandered from ghetto to ghetto, whether it's children's literature or television or whatever, I'm very happy just going, okay, this is where we're going to make something fabulous. And if we can, we do. And I'm also prepared to make a complete mess of things and not make something fabulous. Because sometimes it doesn't work. But as long as you take that and you learn from it, it's all good.
Great. Hi, Neil. I'm Alexandre Callari, and I'm a huge fan. It's a pleasure and a privilege talking to you. I'm a writer, and I'm the owner of a comic book company called Pipoca Nanquim here in Brazil. And in fact, I worked for DC Comics in Brazil as well, and I edited several of her works here. So, as I said, it's incredible talking to you. And my first question to you is regarding fantasy itself, the genre, because I believe that it blends, fantasy blends with the culture and the religion of several people around the world. It's intrinsic to the history of these people. However, as a literary genre, it was always peripheral. It was not considered high literature, especially for the critics. For instance, you have the pulp generation from the 30s. You have the sci-fi generation of writers from the 60s. They were all incredible, and they had a lot of fans, of course. But the critics always despised them. My question is: has it changed nowadays? Has the stance of fantasy changed? And what were those writers doing wrong, or did they do everything right and the perception of the society changed?
For me, I'm not even sure what fantasy as a genre is. For me, fantasy is the things that you find in the fantasy section of a bookshop. And that's a commercial distinction. That's not an artistic distinction. That's simply, it's just like, somewhere on the map. Throughout the whole of human history, fantasy has been the biggest and one of the most important driving forces behind fiction. You start with something like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Bible, and you are filled with magic and miracles, and tales of living forever, tales of talking serpents. All of this stuff is part of the way we saw the world for years. The best-selling book in the Middle Ages were the lives of the saints, and every single one of those saints did miracles, and those miracles were mind-bending miracles, whether they were these were ladies growing miraculous beards, or saints who could fly. These were the stories that they loved then. When we get to people like Shakespeare, nobody ever went, I like Shakespeare's realistic plays, but Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest and Macbeth, they're fantasy. They go on the other shelves. And as time went on, nobody said that to Dickens. Nobody was like, hey, Chuck, we love Bleak House, except for the spontaneous human combustion. But A Christmas Carol has ghosts in it and, magic and time travel. So That one's on the wrong shelves. I think, and what fascinates me as well is I hear you say, and I'm sure you believe it's true, that fantastic literature was despised in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But that's not true. If you look at authors like Lord Dunsany, or more to the point, you look at people like Tolkien. Tolkien the Lord of the Rings books were being reviewed as literature and being reviewed by great authors and poets as literature in the 40s and the 50s. But then you get the kiss of death for any form of literature which is becoming commercially successful. And at the point where the hippies picked up on Tolkien, which was the late 60s, and then suddenly the Lord of the Rings books, which had been considered, they were caviar. They were not books written for a huge audience. But suddenly they found a huge audience. And in finding a huge audience, the first thing they did was you got Ballantine, the Ballantine modern fantasy line, where they just went back and they brought back into print all of this stuff, James Brunch Cabell, Lord Dunsany, Ernest Bramah, all of these amazing authors who had been critically respected writing fantasy. But the flip side of that was then you got things like the Sword of Shannara. You got these books that started getting written to fill a Lord of the Rings-sized publishing hole. And pretty soon, you had the fantasy section of the bookshelves. And once you have that, your critics are not going to go to the fantasy section of the bookshelves. One thing that fascinated me as a teenager was the stuff that was coming in from South America, which I was reading as fantasy, whether it was Cortázar or Borges or whoever. I'm reading these books. I'm going, these are amazing fantasy books. Look, there's an angel. Look, this stuff is impossible. Look at this in the library that goes on forever. And I'm learning, oh, no, this isn't fantasy. This is magical realism. I'm like, well, what's the difference? And as far as I could tell, it was South American names. And the fact that stuff was coming from you guys, which I thought was amazing. But for me, there was never a difference. I liked what I liked. I was ignored by critics until one day they turned around and realized that two things had happened. One of which was that I was selling too many copies of things to be ignored. But the other was that a generation had grown up who didn't want to ignore me, who thought that I was saying important things. And, the older generation of critics had kind of retired. So now, the idea, where are we now? We're 18 years or so after Stephen King got the National Book Award in America. And when Stephen King got the National Book Award, there was a whole fuss about it, and people were very upset, and they were grumbly, and it was a big thing. Stephen King shouldn't have got the National Book Award. 6, 7, 8 years ago, I presented the National Book Award to Ursula K. Le Guin and heard nothing around the world but joy. There was not one critic who stood up and said, this is wrong. When Stephen King got it, they were like, oh, why doesn't literature get it? Why would you give it to King? When Ursula K. Le Guin got it, all I heard was people going, "Oh, about time, this is amazing." And the biggest difference, honestly, was the average age of the critics and who had grown up reading what. If Michael Chabon writes literature and I write whatever the hell I write, and the lovely thing about Michael Chabon is he can go off and you look at what Mike reads and you look at what Mike writes, and here's an alternate world novel, here's a Sherlock Holmes story, here's a fantasy, here's a Jewish fantasy about the early days of comics, and now he's doing he's show running Star Trek for a bit, and they know that he's actually literary, so that confuses them. I started out in comics, which used to confuse people, but now you've got a generation of critics who are comics literate, at least in America and in England. And it's not true everywhere. When I go to Australia, it's like going back in time 15, 20 years, because I suddenly find myself having conversations with journalists that I almost don't remember how they went. Oh yeah, this is how I used to talk to journalists back when I was trying to explain that yes, comics could be literature, and I would have that conversation with them, or the one it's like, well, yes, this is why fantasy can be literature. This is how science fiction. That stuff, those conversations feel like they've died particularly in England and America. And I think in a few years' time, they will have died internationally, because it's very hard to maintain them in a world where people read what they read and love what they love.
Great, incredible.
The separation of literature into bookshelves connects with two questions that we received from fans. One is from an aspiring author, and she's actually asking, what would you say to someone looking for a story worth to be told, that's worthy of being told? And have they all been told already? So I would like you to answer on that. And now that you mentioned New Zealand and Australia, Camila Sadi has also asked about what you thought of literature in this area, in those two countries, and if you had anything to say on that.
Got it. So the first question is, have all the stories been told? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. And the answer is, your stories haven't been told. The stories that only you can tell have not yet been told. Many years ago, I was plotting a storyline in Sandman. And I just about finished plotting it, and I went, oh, hang on, this is an awful lot like a Jonathan Carroll novel that I love. I sort of started here, and I went over there, and I met up, and now it's like this Jonathan Carroll novel. And I wrote to Jonathan, and I said, I'm not going to do this storyline because it's too much like something that you've written. And he wrote to me, and he said, the job of an author is to write it new. Write it new. And he said, your story will not be my story. And I thought, okay, well, if Jonathan says to write it, and I wrote it, and the truth is, my story is not his story. My story is my story. His novel is Bones of the Moon. My novel is A Game of You. They are very different. And I'm so pleased that he talked me into writing my story, because that way the world has one more story. So all stories have been told. Think how many different human beings there have been on this planet at this point. I mean, billions upon billions of us, and we've all told stories. And yet, you can take a familiar story. You can take a Snow White or a Sleeping Beauty, and you can tell that in a way that makes people look at the world and see it for the first time. You can take old stories and tell them new. You can take your stories and tell them for the first time. Whatever you tell is important. So that would be my message to your first questioner. To the second questioner, oh my gosh, I love so many Australian and New Zealand writers. They are so smart. And of course, right now, my favorite writer is probably just Jermaine Clement, just watching what he's done on What We Do in the Shadows and with Wellington Paranormal, a television show that has not yet escaped New Zealand, but that I got to watch while I was there and then figure out how to watch from elsewhere. I think he is an absolute genius, and I just love watching what Jermaine does.
Cool. Actually, I love terror stories from New Zealand also. It's incredible what they are doing there with the horror, you know. It's really incredible. And talking about our memories, for me, one of the most marvelous thing of our stories is how they remind us of our childhood, you know, in a dark way, yeah. And fairy tales, childhood memories, many stories of your childhood and our childhood are references for your work. This is evident in The Ocean at the End of the Line or Coraline, but it's also a theme that runs through your entire work. So, during your creative process, how do you remember those stories? How do you use it in your narrative? And talking about today also, how do you see the role of childhood stories in a pandemic scenario where kids are in their house, you know, in quarantine? How childhood stories could help us in this moment?
So first things first, I want to actually recommend an Australian author because I think she's absolutely brilliant. I think she's just one of those amazing authors who does not get as much attention as they should, and her name is Margot Lanigan. And mostly short story writers, mostly short stories, but she's, whether in novel form or short story form, she's always astoundingly inventive and really powerful. So there we go. Big Margot Lanigan fan. You know, I think as a writer of anything, being a child is perhaps the most important thing that you can have. That's where your batteries are charged as a writer. That's where you're formed as a human being and as a thinker. For me, when I was a kid, I was a kid who loved books, and every now and again I would read books and I'd go, you were written by somebody who has completely forgotten what it was like to be a child. And I would try and promise myself that I wouldn't forget, because it seemed to me terribly important to remember. It seemed to me important that when I grew up, I should remind adults what it's like to be small and to have no power. to be overruled, to be sent to bed, to be in a world that you do not understand, where the rules do not make sense. And that was important in the first graphic novel I did, Violent Cases. It was important in Mr. Punch. It was important there's a bunch of short stories it's important in, and it's obviously hugely important in Coraline and in Ocean at the End of the Lane. I am absolutely fascinated by your question about kids in lockdown now, kids in the age of COVID. I wonder what it's going to be like for them up the line. I don't know. I think that kids are very resilient. You know, I grew up in England during the 3-day work week and a winter of random power cuts, which would, you know, all that happened is you had candles everywhere. I didn't regard it as out of the ordinary. You just regard the world, no matter how weird, as the world. And I think that's a gift that is given to a lot of kids, is you just kind of keep going. But I do think that kids are rediscovering books, and discovering books as escape. And obviously it's not the only way that they escape. You know, kids can escape through TikTok. Kids can escape through video games. Anything that gets you out of the place you're in and lets you go somewhere else. But books, I think, are particularly important in that if you use a book to escape, you can come back a few hours later having made new friends, having been somewhere that you couldn't have gone before, and perhaps with skills or knowledge or tools or weapons or armor that you didn't have before you opened the pages of that book.
Neil, there are several things involved in the storytelling process. You convey a message, you create characters, you create the environment, you arouse emotions. Is there any methodology in the way you develop your narratives, or each process is different? I mean, how do you organize a project from the moment you have the idea to the moment you start writing?
Very, very badly. I mostly, for me, fiction is the process of accretion. Things collect together. Things build. It starts out with the equivalent of a pebble rolling down a hill, and then if you get lucky, it becomes a giant artistic avalanche, destroying everything in its way. Right now, being here on Sky, I'm becoming very slowly obsessed with the past and with time, and realizing that if there is a rock somewhere here, somebody put it there once. Rocks don't sort of randomly get up and move. And some of the rocks that I'm looking at that were put places were put there 6,000 years ago. And starting to, look at terms like lithic scatter and realize that you're talking about stones or things that we used as tools 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, and starting to become slowly obsessed by the relationship between the people who lived here and the landscape they lived in. And that isn't a plot. And that doesn't give me any characters. And it doesn't give me a story. but it gives me a place that stories happen, and it gives me the idea of, could I tell a story that would take 15,000 years to tell? And if I did tell a story that would take 15,000 years to tell, does that mean that it should be a bunch of short stories? One 15,000 years ago, and one 6,000 years ago, and one 2,000 years ago? Or is there a way of taking 15,000 years of people in an environment and creating one story without having an incredibly long-lived person running through that? Because that feels like it would actually be betraying what's so interesting about the environment, which is the people coming and the people going and so forth. So all of that for me that feels like sort of the beginning process of fiction. Because now what I'm going to probably do is just sort of chew on it. And I will chew on it when I'm not doing something else, and I'll chew on it when I'm on a train or driving for a while, or I will chew on it when I'm walking, I will chew on it when I'm somewhere else, and sooner or later, if I am lucky, something else will come along. And whether it's a person, whether it's a thing, whether it's a piece of information, whether it's a myth, whether it's a painting, and I will suddenly go, hang on, if you combine that with that thing about landscape that I was thinking about, that gives me a story. And at that point, I'll normally go, okay, and I will sit and not actually outline in a way that anybody outlining a movie would recognize as outlining, but I'll talk about how the thing feels, and I'll talk about who the people are, and I'll talk about what the shape of the story is. And when I know enough about that, I'll just start. I'll pick a starting place. And I'm always happy for the starting place to be wrong. If I record an audiobook, I will always get to the end of the audiobook and then say, hey, can I do the first chapter again? Because by the time I've recorded a whole audiobook, I know what it sounds like. And I didn't when I started. I was too self-conscious. And the same goes for novels. The beginning of most of my books is the last thing that gets written normally, because I know how it ends, and I know how it sounds. And now I can go back to whatever I did when I began it and go, actually, you're about page 7. Let's start 6 pages earlier.
I very much look forward to those Sky stories. We have another question from a reader and a fan, and I think it connects with the first answer about the times of change. The question was sent by William Matias Moreira. I'm going to read it. Some time ago at a lecture at the Reading Agency in 2013, you spoke about the importance of fiction to promote empathy. In the context we are all living now, full of extremist speeches, do fiction narratives still play that role?
Oh, I think so. And I also think that some of the reaction and upset against fiction tells us that that's what fiction is for. I had on Twitter, I've had several people from Brazil coming angrily about Sandman and saying, well, I suppose now Sandman's going to have like people of color and lesbian and gay people in it. And I'm like, well, you're obviously not a Sandman reader because it always did. So yes, but obviously it will. But it's that resistance to reading about people who are not themselves. The upset that you'll get from people at the idea that, you have characters who are not male and white, for example. that tells us that fiction really is an empathy machine. Because the biggest problem with fiction is if you spend too much time reading fiction, you start to realize that you are looking out through other people's eyes. You start to realize that other people, every one of those other people is a me. And every one of those me's is as important as you are. And you need to care about them because they matter. And I think that's a lesson that fiction can teach us, and good fiction teaches us most of all, is just how to inhabit other people's heads, how to look out through other people's eyes, and how to feel what's happening in other people's hearts.
Well, Neil, you address many psychological issues in your work. It's in the fields of dreams, in the fields of unconscious, fantasy, the dark, and this effect, there's a sense that you really enter in the mind of your characters and also in the mind of your readers, So this kind of impact, this psychological impact, is it intentional? Do you think about that during the process of creation or not? It's natural for a narrative.
You think about everything during the process of creation. And the most important thing is going to always be voice. What is the voice of the story? What does it sound like? Stardust. Going back to an earlier question about fantasy and what fantasy is and how it's regarded by critics. Stardust, for me, the idea was that I wanted to write something that felt and tasted as if it had been written in the 1920s, before there were fantasy areas of the bookshop, when a tale of the fantastic was just going to sit next to all of the other books on the shelf. And so to do that, I needed a voice that was slightly coy, a voice that felt very literary, a voice that felt slightly antiquated. And I knew that by finding that voice, people who wanted big tales of dungeons and of dragons and of burning daring do would all be disappointed. But people who wanted something a little weirder and chewy and more thoughtful would enjoy it. And I couldn't wait to meet my characters. And I think that how the characters are going to receive a story is huge and important. I think that the voice of the story is always even more important. There's one novel that I'm working on for children that does not work yet. And I'm perfectly happy to say that it does not work yet rather than it does not work. Because I know that one day I will figure it out and it will work. But the main thing that does not quite work is the voice of the story. And part of that is because I realized I'm not quite sure who's telling the story. Yes, it has a narrator, but the narrator doesn't feel like Neil Gaiman. So who is it? And what is their reason for telling the story? And I know that when I figure that out, because I know everything that happens in the story, but that doesn't make me want to keep writing it. But when I figure out who's telling it and why, then I'm going to pick it up and just be very hard to stop.
Great. Neil, many writers believe that a text needs to be spontaneous. It needs to be written in a visceral way. They say that if you take too long to write a text, it may lose the strength. Some writers say that, for instance, Robert E. Howard, he told when he created Conan that he just wrote at once, furiously. Has it ever happened to you, this kind of furious process where the text seems to be writing itself?
First of all, what your question tells us immediately is that Robert E. Howard was not married, had no significant relationships, and definitely didn't have children. Because, yes, that feeling of creation coming upon you is a wonderful thing. The ability to be able to turn off the world and walk away and do nothing but type is a magical thing. When I've had it, I've always needed to arrange my world so that I could do it. Sometimes borrowing houses from friends and making sure my children were cared for and telling everybody that I'm not going to be around for 3 weeks or, things like that. Because during the course of a normal artistic creation, I have much more in common with, Coleridge trying to write Kublai Khan, with the nice man from Porlock knocking at the door just as you get to the good bit. And by the time he's gone, you can't remember what was meant to happen next. I think, for me, the best moments of any book as an author are just the moments where you are simply the first reader. You are writing as fast as your fingers will go. A minute ago, 10 minutes ago, you had no idea that this was happening and that this was a thing. And now you are writing something that nobody has ever seen before. And it's magic. Words are dripping like liquid diamonds from your fingers. And that is great. But that's not going to happen every day. And if you can only write when you are experiencing that level of inspiration, you're probably never going to be a novelist. Because to write novels, or for that matter, to write monthly comic books, you're going to have to write when you're not feeling it. You're going to have to write when your cat is sick, and you're going to have to write when you've got 4 hours here and that's your 4 hours to write in, so you have to tell everybody to leave me alone and you have to go and sit down and then you do the writing whether you feel it or not, because that's how it's going to happen. And which is not in any way to lessen the magic of the moments when you are the first reader, but is to say that the most important thing about making art is showing up. The most important thing about making art is creating a space in which the art can be made. And there's an awful lot to be said for being a craftsman, because craftspeople will make art by doing what they do at a level of craft that is astonishing. Terry Pratchett never thought of himself as an artist. He thought of himself as a master craftsman. And by being a master craftsman, he made more books that affected more people more deeply than 1,000 people who think of themselves as artists.
Thank you. You have spoken about taking stories that already exist and making them yours. And we have received this question that I think is interesting, and it connects with the last answer as well. So what, across media and across different formats and all your adaptations, what it is that make a story, a Neil Gaiman story. And when you're writing, when you're creating something, what's your most important concern?
Making the person reading it care enough to turn the page. Everything else is secondary. I remember when I was a young writer being obsessed by what a story was, trying to come up with a definition for myself of story that made me happy. And in the end, the only definition I could come up with was that a story is something that keeps you turning the pages to the end and then doesn't make you feel cheated. Makes you feel satisfied at that end. And I thought that really is everything. I have to care. If I care, the care will transmit itself to the reader. And I have to care to make them turn the pages, which means something must be happening. Something interesting must be happening, or there must be some other reason. If it's not interesting, there must be some reason to turn those pages. And, you know, it's been very strange for me recently that there was a big book came out here called The Neil Gaiman Reader, which is 47 of my short stories and 5 extracts from novels. And we put them all in in chronological order, just order of when they were published, because I couldn't think of another way to arrange them that made any sense. And I started seeing patterns. I could go, oh, well, while this was going on, I was obviously obsessed by that because this story and that story are next to each other. And you can sort of follow giant trains of thought in ways that you probably couldn't meeting them individually. It will be like having a whole bunch of separate songs and then you're listening to, you know, the Beatles albums in chronological order and you're going, oh, there's actually a pattern here, and they get obsessed by things, and look, Paul's just discovered India, and I wonder where this is going to go. So yeah, that would be the most important thing for me, is just caring, writing stories and caring that people read.
Well, Neil, really, really incredible answer. I'm passionate about storytelling, you know, and I'm here like, whoa, really. So thank you for that. And you talked a lot about your references, you know, about other authors and how our memories are impregnated by stories that others, how they influence us by stories and things like that. And it's possible to see in your stories a lot of reference. My question is, how do you think about your reference and how do you inspire yourself to be creative?
I think that references for me are they're wallpaper. You know, you normally have the structure there, but then you can put things down that will make people who spot them happier. It doesn't make, 99 out of 100 people reading the Shakespeare episode of Sandman are not going to know who Condell and Burbage and these members of Shakespeare's troupe were. I could have made up names. But for that one person in 1,000, or maybe the one person in 10,000, when they see me mentioning Henry Condell, they'll go, oh my gosh, yes, and he played the women. And it will just make it a little bit better for them. There are definitely writers out there for whom I feel like I need footnotes or annotations. And I'm never sure that that's a good idea. I would always rather feel like the story is the story. And if I spot the grace notes, that's a wonderful bonus.
Neil, when a writer is young and his text, how can I say this? He connects easier with his audience, with the youngsters, I mean, because they share the same view of the world. However, as a writer grows older, and this is something we can observe as well in cinema or music, it's sometimes it's easy to lose this connection with the young audience. So what does a writer needs to do to keep connected to a younger audience, to keep relevant?
I think one thing a writer needs is to be aware that they are getting old and not to try and be relevant. Because if you try and be relevant, you wind up like the people at DC Comics writing hippies in 1971, and with comics like Brother Power the Geek coming out, where you're just looking at it. I remember reading these things and going, I don't know, this has been beamed in from another planet. As far as I'm concerned, it is okay that I'm 60 years old and I do not understand TikTok. TikTok is a mystery to me.
It's impossible to understand that.
And my daughter can come to me. And she can say, Dad, this TikTok person has just broken 100 million followers. And I can say, what do they do? And she can say, well, they post 20-second dance clips. And I'm like, are they particularly good 20-second dance clips? And she's like, no. I'm like, well, what is this about? And she's like, oh, Dad, I can't explain it to you. And I'm like, good, okay, this is something that all I need to know about this is I will never have to write a story in which it is important that somebody understands TikTok. Having said that, I have over the years, especially when I was a young writer, watched the tragedy of writers, especially writers who wrote for an older generation than themselves, watching their readers die and nobody new turning up to replace them. And I think I'm very lucky that I have books. I've written the Tuesday books for 1 to 3 year olds. And 1 to 3 year olds will always laugh at a sneezing panda failing to sneeze. So I'm set with the one, they will not change with fashion. A sneezing panda will continue to be cool if you are 18 months old forever. So I'm okay there. Coraline, when Coraline was written, kids didn't have phones. Coraline is written in an era when there were only a couple of channels on the television, when it's kind of weird that Coraline's parents are working from home on computers and it needs to be commented on. But I'm not worried about people turning around and saying, well, Coraline is too dated to read, because the story of Coraline versus the other mother is, I hope, as scary and as exciting as it was when I started writing it in 1990. So for me, the important thing is not trying to be timely, and it's not trying to be relevant, but it's trying to be human. And, I look at people who got it right, like Douglas Adams, who people no longer understand why Douglas Adams's jokes about digital watches were funny, because to explain digital watches, you're having to go back in history. But you look at a sentence of Douglas Adams and it's still beautiful. And the answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything, being 42, will be funny 100 years from now.
Oi, Neil. Aqui quem fala é Felipe Castilho, seu vizinho de catálogo aqui na Intrínseca. E eu queria saber, depois de tanto tempo, como que são os sonhos do cara que nos apresentou Sonhar. Obrigado por toda a inspiração e por todos os pesadelos com Corinthians também.
Those are great. I did a thing a few weeks ago where I tried recording my dreams because I was thrilled to discover that I'm in this way that you discover things slowly. I discovered the text to speak thing on the phone, and I thought what I will do is when I wake up with a dream going around in my head, I will dictate to my phone, and then it will it'll turn it into written words, and then I'll know what I dreamed about. And the trouble is that what I was failing to know was that it would approximate and guess at what I was saying, which would be sort of sleepy anyway. So here we go. Here is a dream. It says, in Australia, there are 3 baby guinea pigs and 1 slightly larger. Weirdly, these are also tiny baby goats. I'm in a room being taught time travel. The woman has time to teach me time travel, has filled the space with things from 1980 and sweets and toys and posters and things, and everything is 1980. And I know that if she succeeds, I will go back and I start trying to figure out where I was in 1980 so that I don't bump into myself. Everything is so brightly colored. And I go, hey.
Do you have another one to share before we go
There's
to
a
the
dream.
next question?
Okay, the next one is completely bizarre. I get elected as a member of parliament and I have to resign, but I'm still a member of parliament. I've just resigned from whatever committee I was on, and I walk around with lots of papers. And eventually, my papers I meet some people, and my papers include awards like Emmy Awards for comedy, but nobody is very interested in putting up on their wall, even though it's their company. And then I try to wash my hands with a smoked fish while a baffled Japanese girl watches us. And I wash my hands with this kipper, and then I try to clean them off and get a new slice of kipper and start again. And it's like, okay, that was a dream.
It sounds like a nightmare.
My nightmares get much weirder than that. Those are all definitely, those are all dreams. The nightmares, involve creatures with faces made of spaghetti chasing me through eternal corridors of castles.
Whoa.
And with characters too? With Sandman characters or your own characters?
Every now and again, I will dream a Sandman character. I dreamed being Morpheus once, so I know how that feels like.
Olá, Neil Gaiman, meu nome é Melina Souza e eu gostaria de saber se existe alguma pergunta que você sempre quis responder, mas que ainda não fizeram para você. E se a resposta for sim, qual é a pergunta e qual a sua resposta?
No, there really isn't, because every giant list of questions always includes the question, is there a question that you never always wanted to answer and nobody has ever asked? And after 30 years of trying to answer those questions too, they're pretty much used up.
Hi Neil, what do you think are the best qualities of collaborating with other artists, like the artists of a comic book or the director or the actors in a movie? And what do you think are the biggest challenges of telling a story in a collaboration?
The best quality is just plays well with others. There are people who you would love to collaborate with, but they don't collaborate. They don't know how to play with other people. They don't know how to share their toys. They don't know how to take an idea. You know, it's like a good collaboration is like improvisational comedy or theater, where everything, you were always taught to say yes and. You know, somebody says, whoa, well, we're here in this spaceship and I don't like the look of those things coming towards us. Your next line is, yes, and it looks like they're giant lumps of liver wearing hats or whatever. Your reply is not, no, we're not in a spaceship, we're in a school. And because one way you build a story and the other way it turns into a pissing competition.
Olá, Sr. Gaiman, Fernando Caruso aqui, sou um grande fã do seu trabalho, inclusive se algum dia você precisar de algum ator para interpretar um demônio ou alguma entidade bizarra em alguma das suas adaptações live action, eu estou à sua disposição. E a minha pergunta é a seguinte: recentemente você foi abordado por alguns brasileiros nas redes sociais que aparentemente não entendiam a sua obra e vieram com perguntas e com questionamentos cheios de preconceitos em relação à adaptação do Sandman para o Netflix. Eu queria saber se você já sofreu esse tipo de abordagem em algum outro país ou se essa é uma vergonha só nossa. Eu gostaria muito de saber que a gente não está passando vergonha sozinho no planeta. É isso.
Well, out on Twitter, it seemed to be a specifically Brazilian phenomenon. That thing, I haven't seen that particular feeling of people trying to get one up on Sandman who obviously hadn't ever read any Sandman. I mean, that was the weirdest thing about it, was people going, oh yes, we've read you're going to modernize Sandman, so it's going to be this woke Sandman with gays and lesbians and trans people, is it? And maybe black people in it. And you're kind of like, yeah, that's Sandman. But that was the same Sandman 33 years ago, dude. So all that tells me is you've never read Sandman. And so that particular idiocy,
It is Brazilian.
you know, that feeling that you are being trolled by stupid people who have no idea what they're trolling, is a specifically, it is a Brazilian thing, which is not to say that there are not trolls in America and trolls in England and trolls in troll farms in Russia and all around the world, and you'll get trolled for different things by bots and trolls and all that sort of thing. But that specific one, so far, does seem to have been a peculiarly Brazilian phenomenon. But all I do with that is go, yes, but Brazil is the country where for the longest time, longer than anywhere else except America, Sandman has been published, Sandman has been read, and Sandman has been loved. So I know there are more Brazilian Sandman fans and real Brazilian Sandman readers, people in Brazil who care about Sandman, who love Sandman, who understand Sandman, and who have Sandman tattoos than anywhere else in the world anyway. Yeah. So a couple of, brain dead trolls doesn't make me go, Brazil is a bad place, because I know how incredibly cool Brazil is. And I know that the Sandman love from Brazil has been coming in longer than it's been coming in from anywhere else in the world.
Yes, absolutely. We're very sorry for that. To end it, I would like to ask a final question, and also afterwards, if you could send a message to Brazilians, because we have been missing you a lot in here.
I think that the most important thing right now during the pandemic is not going How are we making art out of this? The most important thing is kindness, and kindness to ourselves, and understanding that this is a time when the entire world is upended, when rules do not apply, when we are under unimaginable stress. And perhaps 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll see the pandemic fiction. You know, the World War I fiction. Really, the important World War I fiction showed up in the 1930s. Because it took that long for people to really understand what had happened and to be able to write about it. I don't feel like anybody, any writer, any creator should feel guilty for not making art right now. I think the important thing is that they get through each day, each hour, each minute, and that we get out the other side into a saner, better world, and one in which we get to make art again. And I think that's what's important.
Thank you.
Oh, how great to hear that.
Absolutely
man.
awesome.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're so welcome. It's good seeing you all, and
Thank you. You're very much welcome.
okay. Bye-bye, guys.